It all began on a night when the rain fell like tears from the sky, each drop a reminder of broken promises and lost hope. People had betrayed him, leaving behind memories of trust and love that turned into cold, cutting silence. In the heart of that relentless storm sat a German shepherd, frozen in both body and spirit, abandoned on a desolate roadside. His eyes, once bright and full of loyalty, now held only a dull glimmer of sorrow, reflecting a past filled with heartbreak and the deep sting of betrayal. That night, as the wind howled and the rain hammered against the pavement, his very existence seemed to echo the pain of abandonment. He lay there, a lone figure in the cold, his once vibrant life reduced to shivering despair. The night was unforgiving. The sound of the relentless rain was like a dirge mourning a forgotten soul. Every drop that splattered on the pavement echoed his loneliness and the harsh reality of a world that had turned its back on him. Once, he had known a life filled with affection and the promise of belonging. His days were filled with playful runs in the park and gentle pats from familiar hands. But as time passed, those memories were replaced by a bitter truth. The people he had trusted, those who promised to care for him, had abandoned him when he needed them most. The cold had seeped into his bones, mirroring the icy indifference of those who left him to face the storm alone. With each passing minute, his hope diminished, replaced by a growing numbness that left him questioning whether life was worth enduring. He remembered the warmth of a kind touch and the sound of laughter that once filled his days. Those were simpler times, when a friendly voice would call his name and the world seemed a little brighter. Now, the laughter had faded into silence, leaving only the constant patter of raindrops as a reminder of what he had lost. The very air around him felt heavy, burdened with memories of promises broken and a future that seemed uncertain. He had been more than a pet. He was a companion, a trusted friend who had shared in the joys and sorrows of life. Yet, as the rain continued to fall, it washed away the remnants of those happier days, leaving behind only the stark reality of a heart betrayed by those he once believed in. The rain seemed to mark the passage of time, each drop a ticking second in the countdown of his fading life. As he lay there, his body growing colder with every moment, the world around him blurred into shades of grey and blue. The relentless storm was a constant reminder of the isolation he felt. Every so often, a gust of wind would send a shiver down his spine, and he would look up, hoping for a sign, a kind face, a gentle hand that might offer him the solace he desperately needed. But the night remained unyielding, the storm unrelenting, and his heart, once full of hope, now seemed to have resigned itself to the inevitability of despair. It was a silent battle against nature, against the tides of fate that had left him stranded in the cold and the dark. In the midst of the storm, a faint glimmer of movement caught his weary eyes. At first, he thought it was just another trick of the wind, a shadow dancing on the periphery of his vision. But as the seconds ticked by, the movement grew more deliberate, a slow, careful approach that seemed to defy the raging elements. His heart, burdened by the weight of betrayal and the harshness of abandonment, skipped a beat in a moment of unexpected anticipation. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he dared to hope. Perhaps this was the answer he had been waiting for, a chance that someone might finally see him and offer the warmth of compassion. The possibility of rescue, of being noticed, stirred something deep within him, a spark that flickered weakly against the overwhelming cold. He shifted his gaze toward the approaching figure, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and cautious optimism. The stranger's silhouette moved with purpose, each step measured and deliberate, as if they carried not only their own burdens, but also the weight of a promise yet to be fulfilled. The rain, which had once seemed like an enemy, now played a softer melody, as if nature itself recognized the potential for change. His body, frozen and numb, stirred slightly in response to the glimmer of hope. The figure stopped just a few feet away, their presence a stark contrast to the desolation that had become his world. In that brief moment, the air was charged with unspoken questions. Would this be the one to finally break through the cold barrier of abandonment? Could this be the start of a new chapter, where the deep wounds of betrayal might begin to heal? His heart pounded softly in his chest, unsure whether to leap with anticipation or retreat in self-protection. Then, in the midst of that uncertain moment, a sudden sound shattered the fragile calm, a sound that neither promised salvation nor despair, but left his heart pounding with emotions. The soft rustle of fabric and the faint murmur of a voice hinted at something unexpected, something that could mend the broken pieces of his soul or push him further into desolation. The rain did not stop, and the night remained dark, but as the figure reached out a hand toward him, he felt an unspoken invitation to trust again. In that instant, as the cold clung to him and the rain continued its song, he was left with one question. Would this stranger be the beacon of hope he so needed? Or was this merely another twist in a tale of betrayal that would leave him frozen in the rain forever? For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The rain fell heavier, as if it too wanted to witness what would unfold next. The figures stood in an unspoken standoff. The fallen dog, too weak to stand on his own, and the stranger, whose intentions were hidden beneath soaked clothing and an unreadable face. The cold had long since numbed the dog's senses, but as the figure reached out again, something stirred within him. A spark of recognition, a distant memory of kindness that had once existed in his world. The feeling was fleeting, like a thread, trying to weave itself into a tapestry too far gone to be repaired. But who was this person? What did they see in his suffering that no one else had? The dog once knew affection, a fleeting reality far removed from the cruelty of this moment. How could anyone care for him now? After everything, the voice that came next was hesitant at first, as if unsure of the condition it was stepping into. "You're not dying here," it said, with gentle firmness. The words, though simple, resonated deeply within the dog. Could it be true? Was someone still willing to fight for him, despite everything? His heart, which had been beaten ragged by abandonment, cautiously beat with renewed hope. But the dog wasn't sure whether he could trust this sensation. After all, the last time he had allowed himself to trust had led him here, to the side of a cold road where he had fought and waited in vain. The stranger leaned closer, her hands trembling slightly as she carefully assessed his fragile frame. The general air of compassion was undeniable, but it also came with painful awareness. She knew she was being rushed, hasty in her choices. The storm didn't care that she wasn't prepared for this role. She wasn't doctor, nor an expert in animal care. She was just a person who had come upon a desperate situation. Her determination, however, was what kept her hands steady as she reached out to gently lift the dog, perhaps for the first time in what felt like years, bringing him closer to the warmth of refuge. She could feel the dog's frailty in every inch of movement, his ribs painfully pronounced through his soaking fur, his shallow breath, each shift revealing the extent to which he had been ignored long before she arrived. But was it enough? Could she possibly mend the damage done to a creature that had who once known only love, but now faced life alone? The temptation to look away became almost unbearable, but there was no denying the responsibility she felt. She glanced quickly over at her car, where her phone rested on the passenger seat. She knew help wasn't nearby. But what if she could find something in town? What if she could nurse him back to health? For a second, her mind raced down paths of doubt and uncertainty. What if there was nothing left to save? The dog lay still in her arms. If he had the strength, he would have fought. But his body was simply too weak. Somewhere deep within him, he knew this wasn't just another incomprehensible turn of fate. There was something different about this moment. There was a flicker of possibility, fragile yet undeniable. But before she could make any decision on where to take him, the heavy air around them shifted. From the shadows of wet trees just beyond the road's edge, the sound of approaching footsteps broke through the ominous whispers of the wind. The stranger hesitated for a moment, their breath visible in the freezing night air. The German shepherd barely moved, his weary body unwilling to react. He had been let down before. He had spent endless nights watching cars pass, hoping, waiting, only to be ignored every single time. What made this time any different? His heart told him not to trust again. His mind told him it didn't matter anymore. But something about the stranger's presence kept him from looking away. Their movements were slow, careful, as if they understood his pain without needing words. A soft whisper broke through the sound of the rain. "It's okay. I won't hurt you." The voice was gentle, filled with something he had almost forgotten. Kindness. He had heard many voices in his life, some loving, some cruel. But this one felt different. There was no rush, no force, just quiet reassurance. The figure crouched down, letting him see their face clearly. It was a woman. Her eyes filled with concern as she studied him. She wasn't just looking at a stray dog left in the cold. She was looking at something deeper, something broken. For the first time in days, he felt warmth, not from the air, not from his soaked and shivering body, but from the coat she draped over him. The sudden contrast made him flinch, his muscles weakly reacting to the unfamiliar comfort. He didn't understand why she was doing this. Why did she stop? Why did she care when no one else did? His mind told him to be cautious, but his body, desperate and weak, longed for the warmth. Her hands moved slowly, brushing against his damp fur, trying to soothe him. "You're not dying here," she said, firmer this time, as if trying to convince them both. Her fingers traced over his ribs, her expression tightening at how fragile he felt beneath her touch. He was nothing but skin and bones now, his once strong frame reduced to weakness. She let out a shaky breath, her eyes reflecting the weight of a decision she had already made. She wasn't leaving him. The woman pulled out her phone, her hands trembling from the cold as she dialed a number. "I found him," she whispered urgently. "He's in bad shape. I don't think he can walk." There was a pause. The voice, on the other end, too quiet for him to hear. She glanced at him again, her brows furrowing. "No, I can't leave him here. He won't make it through the night." The dog barely registered her words. His mind was slipping further into exhaustion, the storm around him fading into a distant hum. His body was shutting down, unable to fight against the cold any longer. He closed his eyes, feeling the darkness creep in. Then, suddenly, he was lifted. Weak whimper escaped him, his body instinctively tensing at the unfamiliar sensation. But the arms holding him were steady, secure, and careful not to cause him more pain. She held him against her chest, sharing her warmth with him as she carried him toward the car. He wanted to resist, to struggle, but he had no strength left. For the first time in a long time, he let himself be held. The car door opened, and he was placed gently on a thick blanket. The air inside was warmer, but his body struggled to adjust, still trembling from the cold. The woman climbed into the driver's seat, her hands gripping the wheel tightly as she started the engine. "We're going home," she murmured, more to herself than to him. Her voice was determined, but there was a tremor beneath it, as if she knew how fragile he was, how close he had been to giving up. As the car moved through the rain, the dog's eyes fluttered open and shut, his exhaustion pulling him under. But just before sleep claimed him, he felt it again, that feeling he had lost so long ago. Hope, the warmth woke him. It wasn't the harsh, bitter heat of the sun or the cold dampness of the rain. It was soft, steady, surrounding him like a quiet promise. He slowly opened his eyes, blinking against the unfamiliar brightness. The room was small but filled with warmth. A soft bed cradled his sore body, and the faint smell of food lingered in the air. He tried to move, but his limbs were weak, his muscles still recovering from days of starvation and cold. Then he saw her. The woman sat beside him, watching him carefully, relief washing over her face as she noticed he was awake. "Hey there," she said softly, a small smile forming on her lips. "You're safe now." Safe. It was a word he barely understood anymore, but as he looked at her, at the way she sat close, without fear, at the warmth in her voice, he started to believe it. He shifted slightly, testing his strength, but she reached out, placing a gentle hand on his side. "Easy," she warned. "You've been through a lot." He didn't pull away. For the next few days, the woman nursed him back to life. She cleaned his wounds, fed him carefully, and spoke to him as if he mattered. At first, he didn't know how to react. He had spent so long being invisible, forgotten by the world, that being seen felt strange. But as the days passed, something in him started to change. He watched her move around the room, always checking on him, always making sure he was comfortable. She never forced him to do anything. She let him take his time. She was patient, kind, and for the first time in a long time, he began to feel something other than fear and sadness. One night, as she sat beside him, absent-mindedly stroking his fur, he did something he hadn't done in what felt like forever. He leaned into her touch. The woman froze for a second, then let out a soft laugh, her eyes shining with something he recognized now: happiness. "You're going to be okay," she whispered. "I promise." And this time, he almost believed it. But the scars of betrayal don't heal overnight. Just as he was learning to trust again, the past came knocking, and when it did, it threatened to take everything away. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt safe. The warmth of the home, the gentle hands that cared for him, and the steady voice that spoke to him every day had started to chip away at the walls he had built around his heart. He no longer flinched when she reached out. He no longer watched the door, expecting to be thrown out into the cold again. Little by little, he was learning to trust. But then, the past returned. One evening, as the woman sat on the couch, scrolling through her phone, her expression suddenly changed. Her brows furrowed, and her grip on the device tightened. A moment later, she let out a quiet sigh, her eyes flickering toward him where he lay curled up on his bed. He lifted his head slightly, sensing something was wrong. She hesitated before speaking, as if unsure whether to say it aloud. "I found them," she finally whispered. Them. The people who had abandoned him. His body tensed. Even after all this time, the memory was still fresh. The car speeding away, his paws slipping against the wet pavement as he tried to chase after them. The days he spent waiting for them to come back. Slowly realizing they never would, the woman stared at her phone. Again. "Someone posted about you. They're looking for you." She hesitated, then looked at him. "They say you ran away." A lie. His ears twitched, his heart pounding against his ribs. A strange feeling settled deep in his chest. Not quite fear, not quite anger, but something in between. They had left him to die. and now they wanted him back. The woman studied him carefully, as if waiting for some kind of answer, but he had none to give. All he knew was that he didn't want to go back. She seemed to understand. Setting her phone aside, she reached out and gently scratched behind his ears, the way she had learned he liked. "You don't have to go if you don't want to," she murmured. "I just thought, you should know." His eyes softened as he leaned into her touch. She wasn't forcing him. She wasn't making decisions for him. She was giving him a choice, and he had already made it. That night, he curled up next to her on the couch, something he had never done before. She let out a small laugh, running a hand through his fur. "So, I guess that's your answer," she said softly. It was. Days turned into weeks, and the past faded into nothing more than a distant memory. He no longer waited by the door, no longer feared every passing car. He had a new life now, one filled with warmth, kindness, and a love that never wavered. One afternoon, as the sun streamed through the window, he lay on the floor, eyes half closed in contentment. The woman sat beside him, flipping through an old photo album. "You know," she mused, glancing down at him, "I don't think you're the same dog I found in the rain that night." She was right. That dog had been broken, lost, and ready to give up. But this dog had found something worth living for. And as he lifted his head to rest it on her lap, he knew one thing for certain. He was finally home.